But thank you, Richard, and thank you, Brian, and the folks at the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. In this, you come to a university or go to a think tank and give a talk, it's good form to thank your hosts and say nice things about them. And sometimes it even has the benefit of being true. And in this case, not only is it true that Richard and his colleagues in this center are really leaders in both the research and the policy worlds and bringing these things together. It's not just true, but it is also well known and appreciated by folks in both of those worlds. And so they really draw on Richard and Brian and company, as do we at the Wilson Center. And so it's a privilege to serve on their advisory board and be able to come out and join all of you, because you're very fortunate you have one of the real leaders in this field in a center that's a leading source of information analysis and practical advice on how to tackle some complex issues that we're going to talk about tonight. So, Richard, thank you very much, despite your setting me up for failure with that introduction. So he said a word about the Wilson Center where I'm sitting. Important to know, obviously, the source of information, the source of the conversation. So we're in Washington, D.C. We're created by Congress. We're formally, by law, a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum. Turns out that Woodrow Wilson was our only president to have a PhD. And so Congress thought it appropriate to set up a living memorial where the worlds of scholarship could come together with the worlds of policy and try to improve both those enterprises. So instead of building an obelisk on the wall that you go get your picture taken in front of as a tourist, we're a living memorial that tries to bring these worlds together. I have a large number of fellows, large number of topical and regional programs, do a lot of bringing people together. So on these topics, we probably have 40 to 50 meetings a year, and the center itself has over 800. So a lot of trying to facilitate conversations for folks who don't always have a place to get together. If you're talking about environmental community, security community, there aren't a whole lot of places, particularly ones that don't have an angle, political angle, right off the bat to have these conversations. So that's what we're trying to do. We're fortunate to have former Congressman Lee Hamilton as our president and director, and our environmental change and security program, as Richard suggested, has been around since really we were, in some sense, created demand-driven, where the U.S. government was trying to figure out how to grapple with these global issues in the wake of the Cold War, with the greater political space that was then available with the decline of the superpower competition, and try to understand how these did, or in some cases the argument was that they didn't play into broader foreign policy, security policy context. So that's what we're about, and that's where the observations in many ways flow from that we'll talk about today. So in short, the objective that I have for this conversation is to give you a sense of where we are now in terms of a variety of different ways that environment and security issues are being linked. It's really a diverse field, as we'll see. And in order to do that, to try to avoid being ahistorical and talk a little bit about where we've been. It'll be a short history, it'll be a relatively brief history in terms of how far we go back. But nevertheless, we see a number of tracks that have been kind of come and gotten a lot of attention and kind of up and down over time. But part of what's interesting is that there are some similarities and some differences, but in fact, perhaps more continuity than we think. One of the absolute critical steps that we have to take to have this conversation is to check our stereotypes at the door. For a class that Richard Matthew is teaching and a whole kind of long sustainability series, this isn't going to be difficult for all of you to do, but you'll be surprised at how many people, when they hear environment, they assume it's hugging trees and hugging pandas. And while the biodiversity and the forestry issues are incredibly important, they are not the whole picture. And they rightly, or unfairly, I should say, make us focus on what are perceived as the kind of luxury item concerns of the wealthy and not understand environment and natural resources as critical to the livelihoods of literally hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people in the world. And so in that context, it's very high politics and a matter of survival for many of these people. And in that sense, directly connected issues of poverty, and then when aggregated, foreign policy, governance, and as we'll see, considered by many as an issue that's appropriate within a security policy context. And in that sense, we have a number of those communities who are already engaged in the issue. So as I mentioned, we'll look back a few decades, and we'll find that there's a lot of diversity. At the same time that there's a lot of continuity across periods, even between some of the administrations that we, I think, rightly think are quite different, that we'll see some commonalities that run across them that are perhaps slightly less expected. And then we'll also see that there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of where these ideas are coming from, or where they came from, originated, how they get picked up in different contexts. One of the common critiques, or common, I would say, misperceptions of this set of issues is that, well, the United States, they're obsessed with security, and so this is a creation of the United States, and it really has context there, but doesn't apply and is not of interest to other countries and other perspectives, when in fact, as we'll see, a number of these issues actually got their start, had the initial research done, put on the agenda by international organizations, other countries, coming from other perspectives. So part of trying to understand this larger context. So this is a laundry list, one that we will not go into in detail, but does start to give you a sense of the diversity of how environment and security are linked. Put it up there in part to emphasize the point that whenever you are engaging with someone in a conversation about this, whether it's a fellow student, a faculty member, or when you are in the workplace and interacting with a range of different folks, you really have to understand where they're coming from and what they're focusing on. Sometimes folks work across these different lines, but all too often they're in one track with varying degrees of awareness and familiarity with the other tracks. So it's really important to understand that a big segment of folks are focused on environmental connections to conflict, whether it's the scarcity of resources or the abundance of resources. Others are concerned about the environmental damage done in wartime or even in peacetime, but by security institutions. The military is a carbon-intensive, polluting sector of the economy. The environmental peace building, which again, Richard is absolutely one of the world's leaders on, in terms of turning that conflict thesis on its head and finding ways to use environmental interdependence to break these things. Human security, essentially a fundamental critique of a traditional notion. We'll talk a little bit about how that evolved. Ecosystem security, I know a lot of you are coming from the natural and the physical sciences. And a lot of the literature in your realms, it's the ecosystem that's being secured, not a community, an individual, or a state. And so that object of security, what is being secured, really have to be careful in specifying it. Understand and embrace some of that diversity, try to borrow the insights from it, but have to be really cognizant of it up front. Then finally, climate security, we'll hear about how it's really dominating in the point of entry for the discussion as we go today. So I promise a very short history, some of which is fairly straightforward. Obviously, in the 1970s, we experienced the oil shocks and rise of OPEC, and really making quite clear the geopolitics and the high politics of energy in terms of its connecting to a foreign policy, the security policy, the economic futures of various economies. And that put at least oil, petroleum products, fossil fuels, in a context of a set of security concerns. About the same time, of course, there was the conflict in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, where the usage of Agent Orange, the defoliants, had widespread and massive environmental and human health damages. And part of the world's reaction, some of which was a product of the Cold War in terms of Soviet Union versus the United States, but one of the products of the international community was coming up with a set of legal strictures against the modification of the environment as a tool of war. A body of international law that in this realm certainly falls within this umbrella, largely kind of tracks on its own with this relatively little connection to some of the issues that we're going to talk about. But we'll find we may be coming back to that to help us address some of the issues that we're facing today around climate change, interestingly enough. But nevertheless was something that really got its start in the 1970s. It's not always put together in this conversation, but I think it's critical actually to have it in the mix. 1980s, we saw some change in this. We saw people starting in the mid and then especially in the late 80s as we started to see the possibility of the end of the Cold War, a number of critiques came. Critiques that came, critiques and arguments that came from outside the United States largely, came from international fora like the World Commission on Environment Development, the Rutland Commission, Our Common Future, which I know that all of you have kind of read for its definition of sustainable development. But there's another environment security chapter in there that is equally important, at least in our realm, the security and environment realm, for laying out a number of arguments, including what we will see really takes off in the 90s, the environment as a cause of conflict argument, as well as the beginning of a broader critique of very narrow definition of security and saying, you know, these other issues are really, in many ways, what threaten us, and we have to move beyond just focusing on countries, just focusing on states, above to the global level and down below to the individual level, really laying the seeds for what becomes a human security agenda. And those calls for redefining security were both advocacy arguments about budgets, but also analytical ones. We're putting forward what was truly threatening us. And as I said, as you've talked, I'm sure, an awful lot about Rio and Earth Summit in 1992, this was meant to be part of that agenda. It, for some very interesting political reasons, did not feature prominently in the agenda of that meeting, perhaps showing some of the early strains and how the UN dealt with it and some real differences in how it was done. Kind of parenthetically, essentially, we in the US were one of the big impediments to having these issues considered there. There were others as well, but it's an interesting history. Kind of coming out of the 80s and in the early 90s, one of the big areas, and it continues to be a big area, but one of the big areas that really animated this discussion was trying to understand about the scarcity particularly the scarcity of particular resources, and how, when coupled with rapid population growth and unequitable distribution of wealth within countries, how that may play a factor in contributing to conflict, not causing conflict on its own, not creating a whole new character or kind of conflict, but nevertheless being a missing ingredient in understanding what causes conflict. At the same time, and well, a little after, I guess, in some ways in reaction, lots of investigation, and put up actually as an alternative hypothesis, although I think it's a false dichotomy, the notion that it's the abundance of particular resources that are lootable, fungible, and worth a lot. So this is kind of the diamonds and the minerals, to some degree for us, coltan, some of the things that go, inputs into our telephones and such, were actually both a motivation for causing conflict and then creating incentives in economies for keeping them going. Places like DRC and such, where rebel groups are sitting on, you can track the location of the rebel groups by tracking the mines and such. So this was a whole set of discussions that really started taking off in the 90s and became, for many, the issue of environment security. In fact, unfortunately, falsely became, for many, the only angle to it. But you can understand it. I mean, let's think about the context then. In 93 and 94, you had the crisis in Somalia, which unfortunately in many ways continues today, obviously, but you had the peak of that, and that was the period of the US involvement. You had the coup in Haiti. You had the genocide in Rwanda. You had civil war in Liberia that was beginning to then spread across West Africa. And these were fragile and failing states that came in quick succession and really posed a challenge to the international community how they're going to deal with it. They dealt with it, of course, quite poorly. But it led to some stepping back and trying to ask some important people asking questions. What is it that is the kind of underlying mix of issues that lead to this state fragility? And is this something that we're going to face more of in the future? And one of those notable people who were asking these questions was then Vice President Gore. He asked the National Security Council. The National Security Council said, we don't pay attention to this. We've always paid attention to nuclear weapons and tanks and such. This is not our issue. Let's pass it to the Central Intelligence Agency. Ask them, okay, so why are states failing? By the way, the Vice President wants to know if environment and population is part of it. And they said, well, this is not what we do. We don't have the answers to this. We need to go outside our set of analysts and bring in a set of outside academics. some folks who were starting to work on this in the academic realm, and a variety of different efforts to try to better understand these issues. Interestingly, they were not just the product of Al Gore's interest. And I mentioned up front that there are some surprising continuities across parties and across administrations. National Security Strategy is a document that every administration is required to, I think, do at least one per 4 years, or at least they have. There's not a set time period for it. But it turns out that even at the very end of Reagan's term, and in multiple years in Bush 41, Bush the father's term, between 89 and 92, the National Security Strategy, which is the overarching kind of top security document, explicitly put the environment as a cause of conflict concern in there. That this was something that the US security community should pay attention to as a potential threat and understanding. So this was before those country crises. And it was a Republican Party. In fact, then the director of the Central Intelligence was Robert Gates, now the Secretary of Defense. So there's some continuity in terms of the people and in terms of some of these arguments that in some ways surprise us. Now, what I have up there, kind of the Kaplan effect, it's kind of obtuse in terms of what that means. Turns out in the same period in 1994, in April, Atlantic Monthly, which is a magazine I'm sure many of you know, ran an article called The Coming Anarchy. And Robert Kaplan is essentially a travel journalist. He'd taken one of the researchers, in fact, a friend of Richard's and mine, Tad Homer-Dixon, some of this fairly academic research, and turned it into an article essentially saying that in the post-Cold War period, as we're searching around for a successor to containment and our broad superpower understandings of what mattered in security realm, the big missing ingredient for the national security issue, he put it in italics, the national security issue of the 21st century was the environment. And that his reporting from West Africa, for him, represented where we were going in the future. This garnered all sorts of attention, including President Clinton's, Vice President Gore's, all sorts of new task force stood up in government and such. A lot of substance, because as we saw, there had some cases where these variables certainly seem to be prominent. The unfortunate part, and this is a lesson that we'll come back to now when we're talking about where we are on the climate and security arguments, but the lesson here was that the world was not just going to all suddenly turn into West Africa. And these massive migration movements between countries that were predicted, migration was a big issue. Sometimes it was for good, sometimes it was created some difficult settings. But the environment, at least in this realm of how it might cause conflict, was not going to be a successor to the notion of containment, was not going to tell us how to reorient our whole foreign policy, and really promised more than it could deliver, which led to a policy backlash that frankly meant that it set back the field, despite getting that very high level attention when it couldn't deliver the silver bullet to the kind of the answer in terms of how we reorient foreign policy. There were many who then didn't want to talk about it at all. And I think that's a lesson we need to keep in mind now we'll talk about in the climate context. For continuing that story of how much or how little continuity, what had been that focus on environment conflict, as well as a significant new investment in addressing some of that, cleaning up the mess that military makes in the past and in the future, was a $5 to $6 billion a year budget under all 8 years of the Clinton administration. Those issues, at least on their top labels, being called environment became a very unpopular label under Bush 43, in part because it was so closely identified with Vice President Gore, his rival in 2000. You could still talk about individual natural resources, water and forests and such, but environment started to take a back seat, and then 9/11 pushed it and most all other issues that weren't central or perceived to be central to the war on terrorism to the background. And so we saw a diminution of interest in these issues, although I would say, while again not in the same formal label, you still had in the 2002 National Security Strategy, so first Bush 43 administration, phrases, phrases like the United States faces more threats from failing states than invading states. So it was a little broader lens. It was poverty, it was regime stability, it was some of these same governance variables that were of interest in the mid-90s. What didn't happen, which some players in that administration wanted to happen, notably Secretary Powell, first Secretary of State, was a big investment in development aid that would be meant to address some of those underlying grievances in unstable countries, that would include, almost by definition, some natural resources, as a way to try to lower the grievance that might be part of states failing or making it easier to recruit for terrorism and such. Ironically, from my perspective, there were the big kind of record increases in foreign assistance under Bush 43. You'll remember the HIV AIDS program, which has been continued by President Obama. And then something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is supporting countries that already, developing countries, still poor countries, but ones that govern themselves well already. So it was reward those who are doing well rather than those who are having a tougher situation. Either way, it wasn't directly affecting that underlying grievance as a cause of conflict or source of terrorism. So kind of ironic that the administration that was focused so much on terrorism in 9/11 actually had commendable foreign assistance increases, but not in areas that had direct conflict, amelioration effects. And the Obama administration we'll talk about in a moment with heavy climate and security context. I mentioned the peace building, and a slide here in part to show you an image of a report that Richard was the lead author, and Brian, the critical inputs in doing for the UN at the request of the Peace Building Commission, because we're moving into a period where two things have happened. One, they've started to stop saying, prove to me that these things have any links, and instead say, okay, now tell me what to do. But also, in some ways, instead of just trying to parse what causes what, saying, okay, what do we do about it? And how can we actually use some environmental cooperation to break the links? How can we use the very interdependence that we have between communities across borders on the same water sources and such? How can we use that interdependence to build trust, build confidence, and hopefully build peace? And so, as the title suggests, from conflict to peace building became a more proactive agenda, positive agenda, one that is animating, fortunately, the UN still today. In that context, and kind of go back to the late 80s or early 90s, this environment, what we just talked about in environment conflict, this is part of a larger discussion, in many ways a distinct discussion, but it got conflated, it got messy in a mix. But it's important to understand that at the same time that there was this very linear focus on, okay, why is Haiti failing, why is Somalia failing, let's look at not just proximate causes, but the underlying causes of it. At the same time, there was a fundamental argument that we need to redefine security. What threatens us is actually different than the superpower relationship, or even organized, one country invading another country. We need to redefine security away from just a focus on the state, to understand that human well-being often connected to environmental conditions and mental health conditions, poverty conditions. We need to focus on the individual at the lower level and the globe at the higher level. So it starts to put some of these broader issues like ozone and climate into the mix that have a kind of global commons issues. Also putting consumption issues in the north, which largely were left off from a focus on what's the deforestation in Haiti. There was no kind of context for talking about high levels of consumption in North America, for example. Brought some of these things together. One of the big manifestations, most prominent manifestations and statements on this, came again in 1994. 94 is, if you want to pick one year to study this stuff, so many things happened in this year. Another thing that happened in 1994 was the release from the UN Development Program of the human security definition in their annual UN development report that included environment, but had then six other criteria that were focused on personal safety and kind of freedom from crime, the ability to have housing, the ability to have food, a clean environment and such. It was really focused on individual human well-being, a tangible framing of this critique that just focusing on state security is insufficient. This had its greatest proponents, and still does, with the Canadians to the north, Richard's home country, Japanese, number of fora in the UN, although interestingly, in many ways informs the agenda of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs. Some of the issues they tackle, like the landmines treaty, International Criminal Court, a broader set of issues, not just environment, but environment was part of that larger discussion. And you know, this is just one example where they make a point. Okay, you talk about security and wars as high politics. Well, if you want body counts, if that's the measure of what is a threat, we'll give you body counts. I mean, 2.2 million deaths a year from dirty water, right? Mostly kids under 5. We can match you. In fact, we can massively exceed your totals with this broader set of issues. And this was the heart of the analytical case, which also became an advocacy case in a battle for budgets. But in terms of what was the substance here. And so it did become an argument about the tools in the traditional security toolbox are insufficient, and the resource, who's empowered and who has the resources to provide that security are misplaced, or at least not well balanced, and we need to associate these issues with the security frame rather than just having them stand on their own, in part because it implied the ability to get to the corridors of power, the high table politics, high politics, where the big money and the big decisions were being made. These issues were, or these frames were ones that kind of evolved through the 90s, had some of these ups and downs across administrations, but really lay a frame and kind of coming at it from different angles for what is the dominant discussion that we have today. Probably, what do you say, Richard, the last 2 years, 3 years, the climate change has really been the point of entry into the security discussion. Back in the 90s, when the focus was on environment conflict in these particular country cases, climate change, with maybe 1 or 2 notable exceptions, climate change was off the table. It was perceived as too far in the future, too slow in occurring. There'll be time to adapt. It doesn't have the speed of manifestation that would lead to precipitating or contributing to conflict. And with the notable exception of Mark Levy and some others who kind of said, wait a minute, this is the ultimate security issue. For the most part, it was just not part of the discussion. And there are multiple reasons, and I have a number of them up here, why climate has assumed a larger role in our broader politic, but also, and that has included in terms of trying to understand it in security terms. These are all issues that are clearly familiar to you. I don't need to list them, but big changes, all of which have suggested that climate change is happening faster, higher priority, and as we'll see, some dynamics that suggest it needs to be part of this larger security discussion. I don't know how many of you wasted money on this movie, but I use it as kind of one example of an extreme on climate where, I guess you have a great story, but freezing overnight, Dennis Quaid can walk hundreds of miles in 24 hours and such. I mean, it's really kind of bionic man that eats day after tomorrow. So kind of on one extreme you have that. On the other extreme you have Crichton, who at a time when the other party controlled the Senate was an expert witness on these issues, as hard to believe as that is. But yeah, the plot of this book is those evil greenies are going to try to make California fall into the ocean, so everyone will believe that climate change is a big problem. So they're the villains, and the calm scientist who doesn't think climate change is at all a problem is the savior, right? So if these are the two extremes, there's a whole lot of common sense or a whole lot of interesting debates, but there's a lot in between them, right? So a bit flippant about those extremes, but part of the point is that we can find some unreasonableness on the extremes, but there's a whole lot to be concerned about in the middle. This is a kind of grossly superficial set of indicators of the expected impacts that we see from climate change. And in this course, I'm sure you've gone into much greater depth and detail, but you can start to see how these are things that are fundamentally affecting countries' economic, political, social, and in fact, security futures in ways that get not just scientists' attention, not just economists or environmentalists' attention, but security community folks as well. And in fact, Congress, they were starting to do it themselves already, but Congress told them they had to do it. So in 2008, as part of the Defense Authorization Act, Congress, then Senators Warner, who was a Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Senator Clinton, before she became Secretary, put in that bill that the top-level defense documents had to take account of an assessment of the threat that climate change posed to U.S. national security and how well prepared are security institutions for addressing those threats. The first one that has come out under those terms is something called the Quadrennial Review, so every 4 years, a kind of review of long-term threats that was done, just came out in February, and included a number of aspects, one of which was, this should sound familiar from back to that early 90s environment as a cause of conflict thesis. Mercifully not framed as some, including the UN Secretary General has framed it, as a whole brand new type of conflict, a kind of climate conflict, but saying that climate change had the real prospect of exacerbating, in this case, a conflict accelerant, another term has come out of threat multiplier, but is making worse some of the situations that are contributing to conflict. They're going to put additional stress on the political institutions, as well as obviously the environment, that are trying to essentially take these environmental hits and channel them in ways that don't end up in conflict. And so frames this as a big concern. The photographs there, as illustrative case, are pastoralists on the top and agriculturalists on the bottom. Long, two different ways of making a living, long time coming into conflict in different parts of the world. But part of the way that can start to see this playing out, it's not that Darfur is a climate conflict, as I think rather loosely the Secretary General alluded to, but instead it's with the increased whole terrific report that lays out some of the real fundamental environmental changes that are underlying these two different ways of life, putting stress on both, bringing them into tension. Then you mix it with a conflict entrepreneurial regime in Khartoum, and then you have some of the conflict mix. So it's not a deterministic argument that it will necessarily happen, but it's something that can make some of these tensions worse and magnify them. So these are some then how the Quadrennial Review views them. It wasn't just the Defense Department, also across the river, as we say, across the Potomac River, you also have the intelligence agencies, CIA, Langley, the National Intelligence Council. You can think of it essentially the policy planning, or not even policy planning, the long-term assessment office of the CIA, although it sits in CIA, although it's for the whole intelligence community, which is, there's 13 or so different agencies. But coming up with some of the same conclusions. It's not that it is a brand new type of conflict, but one that really they see as potentially having fundamental impacts on stability of countries, and that which is appropriate concern for our security institutions. It's a little bit out of order. I wanted to group those with the conflict thesis discussions. But again, to make the point about continuity and the point of illustrating the impact of extreme weather events. So this is 2006. So this is Bush 43, second term. This is the Katrina paragraph in that national security strategy, which essentially said, wow, some of these natural disasters, whether they're natural or human-induced, or kind of leave that ambiguity there, they're really pose threats that can overwhelm the power of the state, including the military's ability to respond. So in that sense, by 2005, and then with the big push from Katrina in 2006, you had an administration that certainly in the negotiations on reducing carbon emissions was, I think fair to say, completely obstructionist. You still had other parts of the government recognizing that these were broader problems, needed to be factored into longer-term analysis and understood as fundamental threats for the United States, for partner countries, for allies, for other countries around the world. Excuse me. And I think it's interesting to look for a moment, and while acknowledging that at the heart of the tool set, shall we say, of the security community, is the ability to project force and break things, there are some other tools in that toolkit that actually have some real resonance in the climate world, and in fact are resisted by a wide range of civilians in the climate discussion in ways that, interestingly, some of the military folks find puzzling and frankly unacceptable. So you have, for example, in one of the prominent reports that had a series of retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals, you had General Sullivan saying, listen, on the battlefield, if you don't make decisions in the face of uncertainty and incomplete information, bad things happen. So this notion that we can't take any steps against climate change until we are absolutely certain of the science is just, is a false argument. So in that sense, of a risk analysis perspective where you plan for the worst, you may hope for the best, but you do actually plan for the worst, and you spend money to try to avoid the worst, is a mindset that would actually move things along on the climate side if we understood some of this precautionary principle and risk analysis that could motivate action and at least take an argument away from inaction that some deploy. The planning, and that these are skill sets that, again, if we get out of our stereotypes, I've had the tree hugger stereotype, I should also add one, I suppose, going the other direction of the security community, that in many ways those tools are mismatched for approaching environmental issues, but if we need to have a full accounting of what some of those tools are before we throw it all out. And then, kind of interestingly, while there's the concern about environment conflict, the one set of arguments that seems to animate the military the most is, perhaps not surprisingly, that which they can put in their terms and helps them with their stability, security goals the most. And that's probably a good reality check in terms of, particularly when we start using the security argument for getting a climate bill passed, which we can talk about the role that all these discussions are playing in today's advocacy debates. But that which is really animating the Defense Department is the notion that, well, if 80% of what's being, of the tonnage that's being moved to the front is fuel or water, and where your supply lines and your troops and your tanker trucks are the most susceptible is in those supply lines, then it's not a big leap to say, well, if we needed less fuel in the front, we would be less vulnerable. And it would cost less money, and it would be deploying troops in smaller numbers to protect them. And so that logic of essentially tactical vulnerability by not taking energy efficiency seriously is getting through, as well as the cost argument. There is a strong, President Obama in the fall put it kind of across the government, including the military, targets for reducing emissions, which they're part of having to meet. There's a perception that in some ways trying to bring the purchasing power of the US government, including the military, to bear in demanding forward-looking technologies that emphasize energy efficiency and such, using the power of that purchasing, a huge market to push things forward. And that is also reflected in the quadrennial review. There's a new position that's been created by that same 2008 Defense Authorization Bill, a director, it's an awkward term, Director for Operational Energy Plans and Programs. The irony here is this person has been nominated, she's had her hearing, but she hasn't had a full vote, in part because you might have heard about this controversy of the wind, the big plans for wind power on the Oregon coast, and I guess up and down some of the western coast, where the Air Force has objected because it's going to not necessarily be compatible with their radar. Well, the Oregon delegation said the Defense Department can't bring on their person who's supposed to try to make the Defense Department more energy efficient until they resolve this other issue. The twisted way that Washington works is, the illogic of that. But Nevertheless, this is something that they're trying to institutionalize in a way that, to some degree, was done under Clinton and Gore, but then fell off the table under Bush 43. So to end with kind of 5 topics as you guys are trying to wrap your arms around some of these topics, not the kind of most important necessarily or the biggest, but 5 things that are, I think they're here and we can start to see them, but there hasn't been sufficient attention put towards them. So in some respect, we need creative minds thinking about how to deal with them. I think you'll see them more in the future. And it's kind of a hodgepodge list, but the first is the role of China. We haven't kind of talked about it so much, but in various conversations, we have some of the security folks kind of making a joke, but saying in frustration, it would just really be helpful to figure out what our policy should be if we could decide where on this continuum of friend, competitor, adversary it is. But it's such a diverse relationship, a whole set of challenges. It's absolutely must be a partner in addressing climate change, or we're not going to really make any progress. At the same time, there's obviously a massive race for resources, with some would say kind of uneven playing field in terms of how those resources are purchased and conditionality and such. It goes to really a big concern. This is not terribly germane to it, but the kind of massive, these are planned and current hydro dams in China. The kind of notion of the massive investment in all types of energy to go towards that economic growth. Certainly a big energy innovator in technology, so it's seen as an economic competitor in this realm. And security, then it's kind of left with a mixed, ambiguous message, but that there is a set of concerns that will be an evolving issue, one that hopefully we can shape and point as friend and competitor rather than an adversary. But it remains a big and unsettled relationship for a whole range of reasons. A second topic, related, but perhaps a little smaller. Do we need, or we see evolving, a new list of what are the strategic minerals in a green economy? So if the world gets serious, as hopefully we're starting to, and we'll get much more, but if the world gets serious about addressing climate change, from a mitigation standpoint, obviously the energy sector is important, and we talk a lot about the importance of getting off fossil fuels in the transportation sector, and that leads us to batteries, which leads us to critical inputs for batteries and lithium and such. And so lots of enthusiasm for the batteries, right? I was reading in the plane on the way here, there was a car review of Mercedes. Mercedes' first hybrid is one that has the first battery to use lithium rather than a nickel-based battery for the car. Not for hybrid, but for electric. The challenge here, at least in the case of lithium, is that 50% of the known reserves are in Bolivia, one country, poorest country in Latin America, or South America. Another 10 to 20% is in Chile. And so it's not a kind of deterministic or inevitable argument, but if we look to countries on the fossil fuel side and the petroleum side that have big control of reserves and are heavily dependent on that single resource, natural resource, for its budget, we're seeing some pretty tough governance situations, right? If we're talking about Angola, Sudan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. I mean, of course, we have Norway as another example, but for the most part, this whole notion of resource curse, having resources and what it means for the governance. So it's not an argument that Bolivia is necessarily going to end up that way, but it starts to become a question, particularly when we have fairly unsettled relationships, just as Venezuela is for petroleum with Chavez. Morales is not a big fan of the United States. And so this is part of then what becomes both a supply chain issue, but one that unfortunately I think kind of all our enthusiasm for going green and electric cars needs to take some of these things into account in ways that understand where these critical inputs are. We trading one dependency for another, what dynamics might play putting the 3Ds into action. This is kind of Washington speak, where you'll find, well, every, I guess, field has its own acronyms, but one of the ones that crosses these fields is this notion of the 3Ds. We now essentially have a consensus among our Defense Department, our State Department, and the U.S. Agency for National Development that there is some optimal mix out there among the 3Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development for the kind of most effective foreign policy, foreign assistance. That security, as we've heard now, particularly folks in uniform say, it's not a security answer in Afghanistan or Iraq. It has to be a diplomatic and a development answer. It has to be part of the equation with the implicit acknowledgement that it's been out of bounds, that we've relied and thought that the answer would come with defense and not put enough time, attention, resources, or sophistication, how we deploy them in the diplomacy and the development side of it. And so this is a battle that is playing out and frankly may seem and is in many ways a couple steps removed from this environmental discussion. But I would say we're not going to have fundamental progress on so many of these issues, including how environment or climate and security are connected, or how we want to accentuate the positive links and break the negative links, until this fight is settled. And frankly, what's, to kind of go into the weeds for a moment, frankly what's happening is the Obama foreign policy people in the White House and the National Security Council and the Clinton foreign policy people in the State Department have a different view of the issues and are at fairly senior levels disagreeing. And so it's either going to take Secretary Clinton and General Jones at the NSC making a decision, or probably most likely having to go to the president to figure out first just the development and diplomacy mix, and then hopefully they'll be in a position to have a greater interface with defense and figure out how, in a practical realm, this is going to go forward. And I think, at some level it is the 30,000-foot view, but we'll have very real in-the-field implications for how these things play out in terms of what's the mix that is a combination to try to address some of these very much on-the-ground issues that we're talking about. Excuse me. To switch gears for a moment entirely, one of the fears that I have anyway, I'll kind of tell you where I'm coming from. One of the fears I have is that, this mitigation and climate change, this whole Copenhagen process, it's really hard. Our political institutions aren't very good at making tough choices for big long-term problems that may have big economic costs, or at least for sure have big winners and losers. And my fear is that the option of geoengineering, of kind of fundamentally trying to either do big changes either to the Earth's atmosphere or in terms of this is shooting the water up into trying to create more clouds to increase the reflectivity, the albedo effect, of reflecting more heat back out into space, or well, there are a whole host of ideas, some of which really sound outlandish, some of which only sound mildly outlandish, that are going to have a real strong political appeal, a kind of get out of jail free card aspect to it that is, I fear, going to become more and more politically appealing. And we have seen what has for the longest time been kind of put to the side as the purview of very creative but slightly wacky scientists, and kind of really perceived as a fringe. But now in some of the signs of it coming into a broader discourse, article in Foreign Policy saying, well, I'm not saying deploy it, but we should at least study it in case we get into a situation of abrupt climate change, we need to deploy something very quickly. National Academy of Sciences coming together to look at some of these issues. It's really becoming a mainstream issue. It hasn't, I think, caught on yet in the political discussion, which actually, frankly, surprises me given how appealing it would be to some parties. But this is one where there is all sorts of ground for developing norms about the deployment of it, because it can be done unilaterally. I mean, you think about it, it's not a stretch in the sense that, For example, for the Beijing Olympics, the clouds were seeded to produce more rain in anticipation of the Olympics. So that's a kind of a small scale modification to affect some of the same kind of change. So when I mentioned at the very beginning that 1970s international legal mechanisms to prevent the modification of the environment as a tool of war, it's those norms that we need to come back to and dig up and see how much they apply. Obviously, it's not as a tool of war, but we need to really formulate and ask some hard questions about whether this is something that has the prospects for such unintended consequences is something that we would need to move into. Almost the final. Bring the climate down to the ground level. In some ways, this is an argument for connecting that whole notion of how scarcity of water and land and forests and some of those different natural resource types might play in stability and economy, anti-poverty, and in some respects in conflict, and tie it to the climate discussion, which in many ways has been the purview of the economists, the atmospheric scientists, and the lawyers, with very little interface and intersection with the development community, let alone out here with the peace building, conflict prevention, security community. And we really need to have those conversations in part by not treating climate in its own box, but having it understand how it's going to impact across these different issues and bring it down into a specific context that allow us to, I think, much more effectively integrate it into a larger analysis, not treat it as something out there by itself. Finally, Richard asked me to say a word about, from my perspective of somebody who's worked in Washington for 20 years and first tried to go there in kind of when your age and get a job, and now having been there in the position of hiring many people, interns and staff over years, and try to have a few words of advice as to those of you who want to be in this practice world, whether it's Washington policy or not, but be active on these issues in the workplace. What's some advice for doing it? And I think you won't be surprised, given how I've talked about the differences across these communities, to say that you will make yourself, you will distinguish yourself if you develop multiple fluencies. And I don't mean just languages, although languages will certainly be very important. But these are very different topics and very different boxes that those communities just really don't talk across disciplines, across sectors, across languages, across geographic focus. And we just really need it. I mean, the issues obviously have those intersections, but we organize ourselves in these little silos, and we don't do it well. And so one of the ways that you can really distinguish yourself is to be able to demonstrate fluency across different issue areas. And that may be as much as choosing very different organizations or very different topics, and internship in one summer, another, or certainly the list of courses you take. But it's something that jumps off the page on a CV, that somebody has really kind of moved out of their comfort zone and what they're obviously good at to try some other things. Because it is, at least in tackling the issues that we've seen most successful, it's those who can be comfortable in those different worlds who are the ones that are the critical connectors that can bring these worlds together in ways that are very productive and certainly very necessary. And then I would also emphasize, as important as the substantive expertise is, almost more importantly, at least for where I sit, we work with so many of these different issues: health, environment, population, development, foreign policy, security policy. Nobody, me or anybody else in our team, is expert in all of these. So we're by definition learning from each other and having to always be learning the substance. What is absolutely critical and what is so much harder to teach somebody are some of the technical skills. So if I could tell you one thing to do, it would be to work on the ability to write, and then write some more. Find somebody who would appear, or by submitting stuff to a blog or to a magazine or whatever, get someone who just turns the page red in terms of editing it. You will learn from the process. It will be painful. It will be frustrating. You will swear a lot, but I'm telling you, it is absolutely the key thing to do, and you've got to take it seriously. I can't tell you how many CVs and cover letters we get with typos, and we essentially don't look past the cover letter that's full of typos. If you can't take the time to make a cover letter clean, then why would I possibly trust you with the reputation of our program by letting you blog and put stuff up that might also have those same typos, right? So I'm telling you whether, and I know it's this, well, it's something where there are lots more outlets than when we were doing this. There were no blogs that you could just throw stuff up. You had to really kind of fight to get into one of the few journals for a hard copy publication. There are lots of ways for you to develop a clip file. Think of it as the way that you get to a second page of your resume rather than just one page, right, with a list of publications. And so, you know, ask your professors where you can do that. Ask them for feedback. Don't let them just take papers and never give them back to you. You want to go and have those conversations with them, with your TAs about how to do that better. I really just can't say that enough. The final bullet point, data manipulation would be everything from GIS and becoming fluent in that, multiple regression, handling big data sets. If you can do that, as well as write, you really have a kind of a valuable portfolio. So I believe that is where we'll end. Thank you very much. Look forward to any questions, comments, discussion we might have. So thank you very much.